confused about when the exam will be open, it'll be open for 48 hours. It'll open at midnight tonight, so it'll be open all day Thursday, all day Friday, and then closes basically at midnight Saturday. So you got 48 hours.
Turn it in Friday by midnight, by 11.
Yeah, you have to turn it in by midnight Friday. But it's not, once, if you download it, it's not timed. You don't have to do it in a certain amount of time. You just got to turn it back in on time. Is that clear?
Yeah.
All righty, good.
Download it tomorrow.
Yeah, good luck on it, folks. Hope you all get A's. No, seriously, it makes my job a lot easier. I have to write far fewer comments on the A's than I do the F's. If you don't get an A for your sake, get it for mine, so I have to write all these comments.
Sure.
Yeah, I know. That's going to be your major priority, eh? On Monday, we were talking about the growing threat of fascism in Europe and in Asia. And as I pointed out, no matter the act of aggression, the West responds meekly. The Americans are isolationist, and the British and French don't have the heart to confront the fascists. And as I used as a classic example, the Civil War in Spain. The fact that Mussolini and Hitler both back Franco, the nationalist, overthrowing the government, and the West does nothing to help the Republican government, the duly elected government of Spain. And we also talked about the creation of the Axis, the alliance between the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians. Now, the Japanese are renewing their aggression in the Pacific. Remember, they had attacked China in 1931 and had been attacking them sort of periodically ever since. In 1937, they pretty much ramped the war back up and launched major offensives. One of these, in December of 1937, was against the coastal city of Nanking.
You might have missed that. Was Russia part of the alliance, the Axis of Power?
No, they were not. They got kind of cozy with Hitler for a while, and then he turned on him, huh? But no, they were never a member of the Axis. Now, the Chinese army had a habit of retreating from the Japanese rather than confronting them. But at Nanking, they made a stand. In fact, it was one of their finest hours. But the Japanese still take the city. And as a reward, the Japanese soldiers were given several days of R&R. And I don't mean rest and relaxation, I mean rape and rampage. They turned them loose on the town. They looted, they murdered, they raped indiscriminately. Thousands of innocent civilians were just outright murdered by Japanese soldiers, many of them simply for sport. 2 Japanese officers actually held a week-long contest to see how many heads they could cut off of innocent Chinese civilians. And the Japanese newspapers ran it on the front page like they were reporting an ongoing sports story. The West was horrified by the so-called rape of Nanking. I'll give you an idea how bad it was. The German consul in Nanking, that's similar to an ambassador but a step below, They even horrified a Nazi with what they did. Now, what the hell do you have to do to shock a Nazi? The United States gets dragged into it as well. On the 12th of December, an American gunboat, the USS Panay, much like the other Western powers, much like the rest of the Western powers, the United States maintained gunboats on Chinese rivers. I wonder how we would like it if the Chinese maintained gunboats on our rivers. But anyway, they were there patrolling to protect Americans and American business interests. On the 12th of December, without warning, the Japanese attack and bomb and sink the Panay. This, despite the fact it was flying an American flag, they had notified the Japanese of its presence, and just to be on the safe side, they had painted a huge American flag on the deck. Any plane flying over could tell it was an American ship. 3 Americans are killed and 45 are wounded. The Japanese government immediately claims it's a mistake. And by the way, they may not have ordered it. The Japanese army had a very bad habit of doing what it wanted to do, disobeying its own government. But the Japanese government, obviously, once it happened, they were okay with it. But they did immediately apologize. And they offered reparations to the wounded, to the families of the wounded and dead soldiers, and to the U.S. government for sinking the ship. So what do you do if you're FDR? The Japanese swear it's an accident. Wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. But they're offering to pay reparations and apologize. Now, what's the mood in America in 1937? How do we feel about foreign entanglements?
Yeah, we don't want to get involved.
Yeah, we're isolationists. Is the U.S. military prepared for war? No. So if you're FDR, what do you do?
Thank you.
Please? Thank you. You accept the apology and the reparations. Which, by the way, is what most Americans wanted back then. They did not want to risk a major Pacific war. So FDR does what he would have considered the reasonable thing to do. How do the Japanese interpret this? Hey, you hit it right on the head. We're weak. My God.
But they're still kind of young in this world.
Who, the Japanese?
Oh, I was thinking China.
Well, actually, both cultures predate us by several thousand
No, I
years.
was just thinking they didn't have, as far as the technology they were getting from us.
Well, the Japanese by this point were just as, they had big heads, but
they knew.
well, they believed they were superior, like the Germans and the Italians, yeah. Yeah. None of us are. You find that out the hard way. So, we accept the apology, but Japan thinks we're weak. They would have never done that. By the way, they already have a negative image of America for several reasons. One, quite frankly, was the racism they encountered when Japanese tried to immigrate to the United States. Secondly, they also got a rather warped image of America from Hollywood. Back then, with movies being new and things like that, a lot of people really didn't know how to sort out the reality from the fiction. And the Japanese are getting a lot of westerns and gangster movies. So that kind of shapes their image of America, especially the gangster movies. They think we're all crooks and businessmen and we can be bought off. So they develop a relatively negative view of us, and we've done the same thing. There's a lot of racism that goes in to shaping Japanese American views of each other. Both nations have very negative stereotypes of each other. And here's the Panay after the attack, slowly sinking. I already have that there, okay? Well, and here's a newspaper, the Herald, and that gives you an idea of what the typical headlines were like. Now, after trying to appease Hitler, allowing him to take most of Czechoslovakia in 1938, Hitler realized that the British and French weren't going to do anything to stop it. The only major threat he faced, if he launched a war, was from the Soviet Union. And they both considered each other pretty much ideological enemies. But you may hate each other's ideology, but if you have a common interest, the Russians wanted to dominate the Baltic. After the Russian Revolution in World War I, several countries had broken away from Russia, including the three Baltic republics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, as well as Finland. Plus, Poland had claimed a lot of Russian territory. The Russians wanted all these back. So in August of 1939, two countries that hated and didn't trust each other signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler and Stalin agreed not to attack each other and allow each other to take certain areas. In fact, the Germans even offered to supply the Russians with raw materials they needed, and vice versa. So politics makes strange bedfellows. Two of the worst dictators that ever lived, Stalin and Hitler, cut a deal. Hitler no longer has to work. And by the way, the Russians then invade the Baltic republics right here, take those back. Finland, they actually fight a war against Finland and take some territory, but the Finns put up a really good fight for being a little country. At any rate, the way is clear for Hitler. And on the 1st of September, 1939, at the ungodly hour at 5 a.m., why start a war so early?
Same reason as in the other one?
What?
They always started early to maximize daylight.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, you're still trying to maximize daylight.
What was that last
World War I.
Same reason.
Yeah, same reason. That doesn't change
No?
basically until the 1970s, 1980s. Yeah, when we start developing a lot better night technology. Now we own the night. It's a good time to attack. Anyway, the Germans launched their attack on Poland in 1939, and that's the beginning of World War II officially. The British and French, who had done little about Czechoslovakia, which by the way was a thriving democracy with an extremely well-trained and well-equipped army. Poland was a military dictatorship with a third-rate army. Yet the Allies decide to come to their rescue. They give the Germans an ultimatum: cease their war against Poland, pull their units out, or Britain and France will declare war. Needless to say, the deadline passes, and both nations reluctantly declare war. Unlike World War I, when World War I was declared, there were huge cheering crowds in Paris and in London and other capitals. I mean, they were out there cheering it. You don't see that when World War II is declared. They're a lot wiser. They've been through it once. They know what this means, and it's nothing to cheer about. In many ways, the British and French limped into the war. Neither of them seem to have a heart, especially the French. There was the German invasion of Poland. And by the way, the Russians, towards the end of the invasion, come in and claim their chunk of the territory. This eastern part of Poland here. Which, by the way, they even keep after World War II. The British and French actually do little to fight the Germans in the first few months of the war. The Germans even joke and call it the Sitzkrieg, the sit-down war. That changes beginning in the spring of 1940. The Germans first invade the Scandinavian countries. They were afraid the British were going to set up bases in Norway and things like that. And then, beginning on the 10th of May, they launch an offensive against France, a major one. And they do something in 6 weeks that they couldn't do in 4.5 years of World War I. They conquer France. It took them 6 weeks. Please?
Is that the battle? Name for that battle?
Battle of France.
Battle.
Yeah.
Does it have anything to do with them breaking the wall?
You're thinking of the Maginot Line?
Yeah, and then.
Yeah. Yeah, the French had built.
Later, is that the same thing?
No, it's the same war.
Okay.
The French had built.
No, the same battle. Did they have to cross the Maginot Line?
Actually, the Germans just simply went around it. Yeah.
So they are the ones, the Germans reinforced it.
No, the Germans, the French in the interwar years had built a series of defenses along the border with Germany they called the Maginot Line. It was sort of a reflection of the trench warfare of World War I, except these were, deep underground bunkers and gun emplacements and things like that. And it was an extremely formidable line, and the Germans never bothered to attack it. They just went around it. So, walls have never really worked very well in military history. Ask the Chinese. Yeah. I don't know how many times.
Seems like
Asian.
bunkers are pretty effective.
Huh?
Seems like bunkers were.
Everything works to a point. You got a determined enemy, they're going to usually take anything. It's only a matter of slowing them down sometimes. Anyway, here's something that was a humiliation to any French person back then. German troops parading through Paris. This left only Great Britain to fight the Nazis. They stood alone. And all this territory in green, dark green, is what the Germans seized shortly after conquering Poland. Now, the fall of France finally shocks the United States out of its complacency. They finally realize that this is a real threat and that we need to prepare for possible war. So in May of 1940, Congress appropriates $2.5 billion to begin rebuilding the military. FDR is also going to bring two key Republicans into his administration. Now, in World War I, Woodrow Wilson had pretty much kept it a Democratic affair. He did not bring any key Republicans into his administration, nor into the peace talks. And that was a big mistake, and FDR realized it. When you go to war, it better be a bipartisan consensus. Both parties need to support it. And Roosevelt realized that. So he brings in two very prominent Republicans into his cabinet. He names Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, and Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy. Stimson was already a highly respected politician. He had served as Secretary of State earlier. And by the way, party politics were not that bitterly partisan in this era. In fact, both political parties, at least up through about the 1970s, late 80s, or early 80s, both parties had both liberal and conservative wings. Today, the parties have sort of polarized. One's more conservative, one's more liberal. Back then, both parties had a mix of both. So you had a lot more interaction, a lot more bipartisan, consideration. And a lot of these guys knew and really liked and respected each other. And Stimson would fit that mold. Henry Knox was a Chicago newspaper man. Here's Stimson. And he'll play a valuable role as well. Stimson will play a key role. He will be one of FDR's closest advisors during World War II. Henry Knox will be an extremely competent Secretary of the Navy, but he's going to have one disadvantage. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he always sort of looked at that as his branch of the armed services. In fact, he often referred to the Navy as us and the Army as them. You're sort of in the middle as a Marine, aren't you?
I mean, the Navy takes it from you guys, so.
True.
Yeah,
Yeah. They're both valuable additions, and it will ensure bipartisan unity when war comes. So it's a smart move. They're both very talented. As I pointed out during the New Deal, FDR, one of his gifts, was an eye for talent. He made mistakes like everybody, but by and large, if he picked somebody for a job, they were the right choice. He named his chief of staff of the Army, George Catlett Marshall. And he promoted Marshall over the heads of about a dozen or more senior generals. And it turned out to be a brilliant move. Marshall is one of the great unsung heroes of World War II. He was a brilliant planner, organizer, and strategist. And it's going to be his proteges, men like Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, that are going to win the war. By the way, Roosevelt, along with Marshall, had a key hand in choosing Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Again, it was a controversial. When Eisenhower started World War II, he was still a lowly lieutenant colonel. 4 years later, he'll have 5 stars on his helmet. He's one of the first Americans ever to achieve a rank like that. So luckily, the people in charge had a good eye for talent. Defeated, but as we pointed out, still fighting the Nazis. And they desperately needed our help. Much like in World War I, the Germans were trying to starve Great Britain out using submarine warfare. But unlike World War I, they start World War II with submarines as well. FDR, after the fall of France, convinces Congress to amend the Neutrality Acts to allow so-called cash and carry arms sales. Otherwise, you can now come to America and buy arms, but you have to pay cash for them, and you have to carry them away in your own ships. That's a baby step towards helping Britain. The second thing we do is sign a deal with them to provide them 40 old World War I destroyers. A destroyer is a mid-sized ship that largely specializes in their original name were submarines and torpedo boat destroyers. So luckily they shortened it just to destroyers. The ships we give them are obsolete. They're still extremely valuable. They're still very good at running down submarines. And that's what Britain needs. They were so-called four-stackers. You can see why. They had 4 smokestacks. So on the 2nd of September, 1940, by executive order, Roosevelt transfers 50 of these 4-stackers to Great Britain. The deal had the approval of the Chief of Naval Operations, Harold Stark, and of George Marshall. So both of the major military heads signed off on it. In return, the United States is granted land and British possessions such as Newfoundland, Bermuda, and in the Caribbean to establish military bases. So it's a win-win for both countries. We get to establish a cordon of defensive bases, particularly in the Caribbean, and the British get the much-needed ships they need to fight the Germans, which was really the real purpose of this all along, was to get the ships to Britain. Now, after the so-called destroyer deal, are we still formally neutral? There's no way in hell we can claim to be neutral after that. We're now actively arming and helping one side of the conflict. So even though we never declare it, we still act like we're neutral. The destroyer deal is really the end of American neutrality. From this point on, we are going to be increasingly pro-British and do everything we can to help them. It's also the beginning of a very strong working relationship between FDR and the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. The two had actually met each other before times. They had a negative opinion of themselves. They both thought the other person was pompous and arrogant. They were both right. Now they're both leaders of two of the greatest nations on earth. And they're also older and wiser. They grew to be very good friends during World War II. Very close allies, and it really helps us win the war to have that kind of relationship. Give you an idea what Churchill was like. His mother, by the way, was an American. And a couple times he came to Washington during the war, stayed at the White House for a couple of weeks, and became the first foreign leader to address a session of Congress. And he had a sense of humor. He said the Americans and British were two people separated by a common language. You know anything about British English and American English? There are a lot of differences, aren't there? Have you ever been to Britain? Have you? Yeah. Kind of different, isn't it, sometimes, the language? Yeah. Calling a flashlight a torch. The hood of your car is a bonnet. I can't remember some of the other ones. Yeah, the bathroom's the loo. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give you a good difference, actually. A little story. When I was in graduate school, we had a lot of German exchange students. And one of them, one of the young students, was a woman named Siegfried. We nicknamed her Ziggy. After she graduated, after she got her PhD, she moved to London because she spoke fluent English and was working for a big company as an interpreter. And some guy got interested in her and asked her out for a date. She said, yeah, sure, that's fine. And he goes, well, should I knock you up around 7? And she smacked him. It means two different things. Yeah. Yeah. Huh? And her English was American English. She's still. I know. That's what she thought it meant. In England, it simply means I'll pick you up at that time. But if you don't know the difference. Yeah. Anyway, that's what Churchill meant. I got sidetracked a little bit with that. Okay, I'll give you some telling stories about Churchill. Got one more, and it again tells you about the working relationship between him and FDR and a lot about Churchill. Roosevelt kept a pretty regular schedule. Got up at the same time, usually ate lunch, usually went to bed early. Early for him was about 11 or so. Churchill was one of those people that, he was kind of a night person. He liked to sleep till 10 or 11 in the morning, maybe 12. And then he'd work till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And it was hell on his age, by the way. I'd like to be trying to catch a good night's sleep and have him call you up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Get over here, I need you. Anyway, he was staying at the White House. And he got up late as normal. And the White House back then was somewhat of a fire trap and rather rickety. It'll be basically rebuilt later during the Truman administration from the ground up. There were doors that opened up to rooms, that opened up to other rooms, that opened up to other rooms, and then you'd open another door and there'd be a wall there. So you never knew where you were going to go. He was assigned one of the nicer bedrooms, but that opened up to a bathroom, which also opened up to a small meeting room. And Roosevelt was meeting with several members of his cabinet that day. Churchill went in, took a shower, got confused, and walked through the wrong door and started taking the cigar right into the cabinet. Totally, looked around and said, "This is to show you the British Empire has nothing to hide from its American allies." And then regally stormed out of the room. And Roosevelt cracked up laughing. So the two had a pretty good working relationship. They had similar senses of humor and similar objectives in the world. They do develop a very strong relationship. Now, Roosevelt was committed to preparing the United States for this war. And in August 1940, he has Congress authorize calling up the National Guard. He puts them into federal service. And in October of 1940, Congress passes the Burke-Wadsworth Bill, better known as the Selective Service Act of 1940. They're instituting a draft. We've had drafts in the past, but this is going to be the first one that was passed during peacetime. The other two draft laws were passed during a war, during the Civil War and during World War I. We're still technically at peace. So the Selective Service Act of 1940 is the first peacetime draft in American history. Under the Burke-Wadsworth Act, all American males between 21 and 35 had to register for the draft. And within a year, that would be changed to 18 to 45. The first draftees were liable for only a year service. And there were others. It could only be used in the defense of the Western Hemisphere. Germans attacked us, or Brazil, it could be used. But they did not be sent. They could also be used in American possessions overseas, but that was one exception. They are chosen through a lottery system. That was considered most fair. Everybody registers. They didn't need everybody, obviously. And then they pull numbers out of a big drum, and if that's your number, you get drafted. And by the way, if you had number 181, you were the first person drafted. What are the numbers based on? Or 158. Much like later stages of the Vietnam War, it's going to be based on your birthday. And much like the Vietnam War, the lower your number, the better chance you have of getting drafted. If you're the first number picked, you're screwed. You're getting drafted. If you're 365th, you have a pretty good chance of not getting drafted. The first draft will bring 900,000 young men into the Army. It began in October, and remember, they're only supposed to serve 12 months. They were supposed to be discharged the following October. But by the summer of 1941, and especially in the Pacific, there are ominous signs that we will be at war soon. So Congress extended their enlistment, even though they don't. A lot of them threatened to desert when October comes. They're told they only have to serve 1 year. Now Congress is breaking that deal. A lot of them say they belong to the Ohio movement. And it has nothing to do with this great state. The Ohio movement was an acronym. Ohio stood for Over the Hill in October. Otherwise, when my enlistment's up, I'm gone. Despite all the threats and the grumbling, when October 1941 came, very few of the draftees actually deserted it. But there was these rumblings. Americans weren't used to a peacetime draft. By the way, here are some of the first selective service inductees. See how they look? And Hollywood jumped on this. They started making comedies about the draft, showing you how seriously we took the coming of war at first. This is really the first draft movie comedy, and it stars Abbott and Costello. You've probably heard of them. This is a movie that really made them household names. And within a year, every major studio was making comedies about the draft. Here are the Three Stooges and theirs. You guys have heard of the Three Stooges, haven't you? Have you heard of Abbott and Costello? Hmm? The location of German submarines, German U-boats. They're actively tracking the U-boats. They're not attacking them. And they're reporting back to the location of the fire. In England. Now, that was in you have to be daring, you have to be willing to take risks. It's an extremely dangerous occupation, and if you're not creative and aggressive, you're going to be at the bottom of the ocean a lot quicker. So a lot of them can't resist. They're being provoked, they attack. In September of 1941, the U.S. Greer is fired on but not hit by a U-boat it was stalking and raiding its location to nearby British ships. Roosevelt jumps on this on the 11th of September, denounces German piracy, and announces the U.S. will escort convoys as far as Iceland. And American warships are now authorized to fire on German U-boats if they attack. So now we're doing part of the British job for them. We're escorting, it figures I don't have Iceland on this map. But we're escorting the ships halfway across the Atlantic and just daring the Germans to attack. On the 17th of October, the American destroyer Kearney is torpedoed, but not sunk. It was depth charging a German submarine at the time. 11 Americans were killed. And on Halloween, October 31st, the Reuben James, an American destroyer, is sunk off Iceland. And 115 men out of its 159-man crew are killed. American merchant ships are now armed and allowed to carry munitions straight to England. As I'll develop on Friday, some people have accused FDR, incorrectly, of trying to get us involved in a war in the Pacific. Quite frankly, all the evidence indicates he's trying to avoid a war in the Pacific and provoking one in the Atlantic. You can make a strong argument Roosevelt is trying to provoke the Germans. And by the way, at the same time, we're negotiating with Japan. We don't want to fight a two-front war if we can avoid it. FDR is provoking Germany because he knows, him and his top advisors know things that no other American knows at this point. Our relationship with the British has supplied us with some very important intelligence. We know that the Germans are working on two extremely advanced and important weapons. From the British and from a little-known scientist, you may not have heard of this guy, named Albert Einstein. Never heard of him? Einstein, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, all of the top positions. I'm having a great day. All of the great minds in physics and that have signed a letter and sent it to FDR warning him that the Germans are working on building an atomic bomb. They had already proven theoretically one could be built and made. And the British confirmed it for us. By the way, what is Szilard, Einstein, Fermi, what do they all have in common, aside from being some of the greatest minds of the 20th century? No, Fermi's Italian. Szilard's Hungarian. You're thinking, though. Huh? No. Szilard will be important to our building it. No, he's a theoretician. He is not directly involved in the Manhattan Project. What do these two gentlemen have in common? They're all Jewish. They should have you. You're the one. You got it. Goes to show you the Germans considered them inferior. And they're three of the most brilliant people on earth, and they will help us develop a war-winning weapon. So much for being inferior, eh? Oh, they wanted us to build it to drop on Germany originally, which was the original plan. What's the other weapon the Germans are working on? They're working on what today we would call, they're working on two different types of missiles. They call them the V1 and V2, that's the vengeance missile. But the
V1 was the equivalent of a modern-day cruise missile. The Germans pretty much developed that. The V2 is the first ballistic missile. Now, you have a common palm and a ballistic. What does that say about our security? What are you going to do if you're FDA?
Oh, yeah, we start the Manhattan Project. But can you see why he understands why we need to get involved in this war? Anyway, here's